And this is my 6th time. Jonah, Genesis, Joshua, Job, Daniel, and now this.
You're a regular.
Yes, you are. Sure are.
I'm going to go tell those guys that you're going to be introducing them.
Okay.
You might just stand right here.
I love the shot of whatever that was that I saw there climbing up.
Yeah.
Did you get the media thing that the couple from California did that's all coordinated of the days of our trip and the places we went? And did you ever get that?
I don't know. I think I kind of remember
It's an
something like that.
extensive,
Yeah.
marvelous coordinated.
Yeah.
Is this from Chosen?
This is the Old Testament one's going to be the covenant. So same kind of thing, yeah. But one of those shots is from the Chosen.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are you playing something?
Yes, I am.
I might need to select the output on the surface.
Okay, so should I stop this?
Well, yeah, why don't you exit out of full screen quick?
Okay.
Go down to the audio settings. Headphones. Try turning volume up. What about 80 to 90?
Hello, come with me.
If you can play that video again, that'd be great.
Okay.
Yes, yes, okay. We're not ready yet.
Not ready.
Wow.
We'll see what works out. I just don't know. Yeah.
Okay.
Sounds good to me. Yeah.
continue to do that, we'll have to find a different way to.
I'd say the screens. And a wonderful opportunity to go a little deeper. So if you can find your seats, it would be wonderful if you sat close and consolidated so there was a sense of community. That would really be helpful. But I have the wonderful privilege of introducing our guest for this series, my friend, Dr. John Walton. And this is the 6th time he has been here to present an Old Testament book. I am so grateful for his ministry and his scholarship. I have learned so much from him, such little things like the Bible was not written to us, it was written for us. And another one, it can't mean now what it never meant then. Those are just helpful things that have helped me know how to read the Bible. I also had the privilege of going to Israel with him a couple of years ago for a 2-week tour of Israel and going to some dig sites and all of this. He has a new book called The Lost World of the Torah, which you're going to hear about. There in the back corner table, his work is there. But Dr. John Walton, professor of Old Testament at Wheaton College for 20 years, is here as our guest for this hour. And welcome, Dr. Walton.
Thank you, Scotty. Well, good morning. And thank you. Glad you all have come. And I'm sure you'll be able to hear fine, but you sure look far away. So here I am up on the stage, and you're down there, but we'll still try to connect as we go. So this week's lessons are on the 10 Commandments. That may be the last time I use that word commandments, because I'm going to give you some other ways to think. We have to start out by talking about the Torah, as you can see hopefully on the screen, yes. Now, Torah might be an unusual word to some of you. It's a Hebrew word, and it might be unusual, so let me just explain a little bit what we're doing here and how we're going to get into our material. Some people think of the word Torah, and they think that it refers to the first 5 books of the Bible, also called the Pentateuch. Our Jewish friends call it the Torah, and they refer to those 5 books. But that's not what I'm using it for. Torah is also the Hebrew word that is translated, usually, law in your Bibles. So whenever you read the word law, it's likely that the Hebrew word they're translating is Torah. I'm going to question that also. I'm going to be stretching you a little bit. Yeah, pushing the boundaries a little bit. But we have to make sure that we've got our terminology refined and nuanced so that we can even talk about the material. So the Torah is what is often called the law. And so I'm going to call it the Torah, and you'll know what I'm talking about. The 10 Commandments are often considered a central part of the Torah. And of course, they are part of the Torah. We'll discuss what role they have in the Torah as the week goes on. But I prefer not to use 10 Commandments because the Bible never calls them the 10 Commandments. Isn't that surprising? The Bible never calls them the Ten Commandments. We have another word that we use to describe these. It's the Decalogue. Maybe some of you have heard that word, the Decalogue. You might recognize deca there as 10. Okay. Log, you might recognize from Logos. In John 1, in the beginning was the Logos, the Word. And so Decalogue is the 10 words. And in fact, that's what the Hebrew text calls them, the 10 words. Now, even that information itself throws us for a little bit of a loop. We're used to thinking about them as the commandments. But that's not what they're called. And it's actually the word commandments that usually tells us what we should do with them. We know what to do with commandments. When you hear a commandment, you obey. But what about when you hear a word? These are some of the things we're going to be talking about. Today, in this session, we're going to be trying to give a little bit of a foundation in this concept of Torah, the bigger piece, because we can't get down to the little piece until we understand the big piece. So we're going to talk about Torah today. And then tomorrow, we're going to talk about how does the Decalogue fit into the Torah. Now, before about 5 minutes ago, you would have rather heard, how did the 10 Commandments fit into the law? But yes, I'm mixing that up. So how does the Decalogue fit into the Torah? Then finally, by Wednesday, we'll start to be able to go through the 10 and try to understand each one of them. And that'll be Wednesday and Thursday. And then Friday, we're going to talk about what do we do with it? How do we now think about the Decalogue? So that's sort of our schematic for the week of how we're going to approach it. So as we start out this morning, before I can even get to Torah, I can't help myself. I just do this. We're going to talk about how we think about the Bible as an ancient document. As Scotty mentioned, the Bible is written for us. It's for everybody. God's revelation to the world throughout all history. The Bible is written for us, but it hasn't been written to us. You know that because you're reading a translation. It's not in your language. So we have to start with understanding that concept. I'll try to go quickly. I do this material almost every time I do something with the Old Testament, so we know what we're doing. So let's get going so that we can move through this treatment and try to understand it. So I've been on a quest my entire career. I'd like to think that maybe it even started when I was younger, but certainly in my adult life, I've been on a quest. And that quest is to be a faithful interpreter. I understand that because interpretation is a tricky thing, a complicated thing, I understand that I might not always be right. I try my best. But sometimes as time goes by, I change my mind. So I can't have a certainty that I'll always be right. It's nice to think I want to get the right interpretation. And I hope I get there sometimes. But even before that, I want to be faithful. Faithful to the text as I know it, with what I know, faithful to the text with the research that I've done. I want to be faithful to the text. And that requires a certain amount of understanding about what the text is and how we deal with text. And the first point I like to make is that faithful interpretation calls for accountability. Because we're not just interpreting any piece of literature. We are interpreting God's word. And it's literature, yes, but it's literature with authority. And the way we respond to authority is to submit to it. And if we're thinking about how we need to submit to God's word, then we ought to be thinking about that term, accountability. We cannot freelance. We can't just wander through the text doing what feels good to us or seems right to us, or this is kind of what it said to me this morning. Who are you accountable to when you do that? So we are accountable, and when we talk about accountability, we're accountable to the truth claims that the text makes. As God's word is revelation, scripture to us, it has truth claims to make. And we want to make sure that we understand what those are, so we're accountable to those truth claims. Now, how do we get them? How do we get to those truth claims? Well, God set up the process. That is, these truth claims are the ones that are affirmed in the communicated intentions of the human instruments. Sometimes we call them the authors, but it's more complicated than that. There are compilers, there are editors, people doing composition. There's a whole ream of human instruments involved. But God gave his message through those human instruments. And therefore, if we want to be accountable to God, I'm assuming that's a yes, okay, then we have to be accountable to the instruments that he used. So that's our process. That means we have to understand as best as we can what those human instruments, what those authors intended when they wrote, in the words they used and the literature they used to do it, in the world in which they lived, in that communication bond between themselves and their audience. Their audience. We are not their audience. It's not to us. When you're in an insider communication, you can communicate effectively even if you leave a lot of things unsaid, because you've got a mutual understanding in culture and communication. So communication within a family, think about the communication between twins, but then in a family or in a given church or in a culture, there's always certain things that go without being said. But if you get outside that circle and you've left those things without being said, then the outsider isn't going to understand. So we have to try to move into the insider circle so that we get every little bit of of communication that we can. So when we think about the authority, we understand that God's purpose is carried out through human purpose. He vests his authority in these authors, in these human instruments. And therefore, once we understand that the Bible is for us but not to us, we recognize that we have to try to immerse ourselves in their, what I call, cultural river. Now, let me talk about cultural river just for a moment. I usually spend more time on this, but we're on a mission here. So, a cultural river. Let's start with our modern cultural river. Our modern cultural river is made up of all kinds of things. You'll see words coming up on the screen. All sorts of things, political, economical, values, all sorts of elements, religion, the world around us, science, are all part of our cultural river. It's things that, again, to some extent go without being said. We're all in a familiar cultural context. And so all of these things are things that frame our lives. Some of them we like. We probably like the idea of freedom and human rights. It'd be hard to find somebody who said, no, I don't, I'm against it. Okay, so most of them we like, some of them we don't. There are some aspects of our culture, especially as Christians in a broader secular culture, there are some aspects of our cultural river we don't care for. And we might even try to stand against them. Maybe at one Christmas at some time you decided, we're too consumeristic. We're going to do Christmas different. We're not going to have presents. And after the kids let you out of the closet, tied up, try not being a consumer. It's kind of tough. So some things we don't like or we want to stand against, okay, but we're in the cultural river. Even if we're trying to swim upstream, even if we're trying to resist the currents of that river, we're in it. And our conversations take place in that context, whether we agree with them or not. Now, the important point to make is nobody in ancient Israel knows anything about our cultural river. To an ancient Israelite, most of these words would be meaningless, and even if you tried to explain them, you'd have trouble. They would have no idea. They do not know our cultural river, and as authors, even writing scripture inspired by God, they do not anticipate our cultural river. You don't go to Proverbs expecting to find a hidden verse about social media. Although some people probably try. You don't go to the Torah, to Deuteronomy or Exodus, and expect to find a differentiation between a market economy or an agro-pastoral economy. You don't expect to go to Kings and find a discussion about the preferences of monarchy versus democracy. And you shouldn't expect to go to Genesis to find a discussion about evolution or the Big Bang. They do not know our cultural river. They are not writing to our cultural river. They are not anticipating our cultural river. Yet, many of us, when we read the Bible instinctively, read it through the lens of our cultural river. Well, instead, I propose we have to read the Bible as best we can through their cultural river. So what does their cultural river look like? Well, again, some words are coming up on the screen. Some of these you'll recognize. You'll say, oh, I know a little bit about that, or, oh yeah, I know what that's about. But you take something like kingship, which is already there on the screen. What we think about kingship today is very unlike what they would have thought about kingship in the ancient world. So even when it looks like the word is familiar to you, the odds are the cultural river is still distant. If we're going to understand what they have to say about kingship, we need to try to understand kingship, what's in their backpack that's got the kingship label on it. Trying to understand their cultural river. Now, already some of you are a little bit uncomfortable because you're saying, that sounds like work. Yeah. Lots of things that are worthwhile take work. People decide they're going to Scotland for a vacation. They don't just get on a plane and go and then land and say, gee, I'm just going to walk and see what I see. Talk about a wasted vacation. You plan, you research, you come up with some ideas of what you're going to do. It's work. Now, we would like it if we could just read the Bible as it is. You're making it so hard, Doc. I just want to sit down with my Bible and my cup of coffee and my nice sunroom and let the Spirit wash over me. I can imagine that's what we'd like to do. But the trouble is when we try to read it as it is like that, more likely than not, we're reading it from our own cultural river. And that means we're imposing something on the text that is foreign to the text. And if we're imposing something on the text that is foreign to the text, then we have drained the text of its authority. And we're no longer being accountable to it. We're accountable to kind of our impulses, our instincts, but those instincts are our modern cultural river instincts. And so we have to face the problem that reading instinctively is not reliable. Doesn't mean it's always wrong, don't get me wrong on that, but it's not reliable. I mean, we read the Tower of Babel and our instinct is that people were trying to get up to God in their pride and you're already wrong on 2 counts. Ziggurats, these towers in the ancient world, are not built for people to go up. They're built for God to come down. And when they're making themselves a name, that's not an act of pride. That's an act of greed. They want God to come down, and they'll do everything they can to make him happy and pampered, and the idea is that then he will bless them with great prosperity. See what happens when we read instinctively? Spoiler alert, Wednesday and Thursday, we're going to go through the Ten Commandments, and I'm going to show you the same kinds of things where our instinctive reading has led us astray. Ooh. And you're saying, I don't know if I want to do that or not. Okay, so if we want to submit to the authority of the Bible, we have to hold ourselves accountable. And that means we have to try to work at understanding their cultural river. We can't read a text more literally than to read it as the author understood it. The author is our portal. Now, let me say a very quick word about the Holy Spirit here. Because some of us, maybe you were even offended when I talked about reading your Bible and the Spirit washing over you. The Spirit can lead us when we read Scripture. I'm not denying that. The Spirit could also lead you when you're reading Tolkien, by the way, or Harry Potter or Jane Eyre. The Spirit's not limited to speaking to you just because you're reading the Bible. But the Holy Spirit is not putting the seal of approval on your instincts. Okay? Usually the Spirit leads us to know what to do with the message once we know the message, rather than the Spirit telling us what the message is. And the main point I make from that is that we can never use the Spirit in an appeal to authority. This is what the text means, and I know that's right because the Spirit told me. Sorry, that's a conversation ender. Unverifiable, unfalsifiable, nothing to say from that point. No evidence, just God told me. And that leads to things like the Crusades and Manifest Destiny and the Inquisition and antebellum slavery and the Holocaust, and never mind. Loads of people can say the Spirit told them something. So when we are interpreting text, we want to bring evidence to our interpretation. And that includes the culture. So we have to ask the questions that they're asking. If you've been here other years, you may have heard me tell this story. Matter of fact, you may have heard this whole part of the lecture before. But little kid, 10-year-old Tommy walks into the kitchen. Mom, where did I come from? She panics. What am I going to tell? I wasn't ready for this yet. I don't know what to say. How do I explain all of this? Okay, Tommy, sit down. So the stork thing won't work. Okay. So she starts into kind of birds and bees, and then egg and sperm, and a man and a woman fall in love, and doesn't feel very good about where it's going and how that's all working. But she blunders through it. Finishes up, and she said, so, Tommy, do you have any questions? He said, no, that's okay, Mom. He said, but, my friend Billy, he says he comes from Indiana. If we don't understand the question that's being asked, if we don't understand the answers that are being given, we've already lost our link. Accountability. So, we want to read the Bible then against its ancient Near Eastern background. And so that means that we have to recognize, yes, there are different cultures in the ancient world that differ from one another. But still, there's a lot that's shared across the region and across time in the ancient world. And we can recognize those and focus on those. The biblical distinctiveness is not in its isolation. This is not a culture in a vacuum. They are part of the ancient Near Eastern world, and we see a lot of continuity with the ancient Near Eastern world, but They did have revelation from God that helped them transcend that world. But in the same way, we receive revelation from God that sometimes helps us transcend our cultural river. It doesn't mean we're not in the cultural river. So we can't treat the Bible as if it's totally isolated from the world around it. So we need to recover ancient ways to read their texts well. In that sense, we need to try to find or engage in being cultural brokers, negotiating between cultures so that there's clear understanding. There's an awful lot that the Old Testament doesn't change. God doesn't change their view on. He doesn't change their view about physiology or cosmic geography, metaphysics, about climatology. God doesn't give them information that's going to lead them to think differently than the world around them. In the ancient world, they believed that cognitive processes took place in the heart, the liver, the kidney, the intestines, the stomach. Sometimes I think with my stomach. But at any rate, they didn't know anything about the physiology of the brain. And God didn't change it. They were part of their cultural river in how they thought about physiology. So, the Bible is embedded in the ancient world. That's not to say it's indebted. I'm not saying they borrowed literature. We'll talk about that a little more. It's not importing or imposing the ancient Near East. You can't impose the ancient Near East on the Bible because, well, it is the ancient Near East. That would be like saying, Dr. Walton, why do you keep imposing Hebrew on the Old Testament? I can't impose Hebrew on it. It's written in Hebrew. Okay? Ancient Near Eastern texts actually can prompt us to think differently. When we read Babylonian texts or Canaanite texts or Egyptian texts, they provide windows of how people thought in the ancient world. It can help us understand that cultural river. And the more we can understand that cultural river, the more we can read the text as the author intended to speak it, that communication between the author and his audience, then we will be getting closer to that focus that we have of faithful interpretation. Now again, this is all just methodology, but all of this is going to become very important as we try to look at the Decalogue. So, when we try to use the ancient Near East, we recognize that new tools require new methods. We have new resources that people didn't have 100 years ago. Some that people didn't have 20 years ago. I just finished writing a commentary on Daniel, and I'm interacting with lots of the Neo-Babylonian royal inscriptions. Nebuchadnezzar is one of the Neo-Babylonian kings. 5 years ago, those weren't published. We didn't have the Neo-Babylonian inscriptions from Nebuchadnezzar. Now we've got 80 of them. That can make a difference. New tools. So I can talk about things that even a commentary written 5 years ago couldn't talk about. They didn't have the material. Now, whenever we read text, of course, we can't be free of our own culture. But we can try to push it aside as best we can, realizing that the Israelites thought more like Babylonians or Egyptians than they think like us. They're in that cultural river. So we may not be able to recover the ancient Near East in any significant way, any comprehensive way, but we can do what we can. We can learn enough to at least prevent us from imposing some of our modern ways of thinking onto the biblical text. Okay, that was the quick thing on methodology to help us make this move into the study of Torah. So, here you are, sitting at the base of Mount Sinai. You've left slavery in Egypt, followed Moses, seen the Red Sea part, gone through the wilderness, got some water from a rock, all of those things, and now here you are camped around the foot of Mount Sinai. and the word spreads like wildfire, God's going to speak from the mountain. God is going to come down to that mountain, the God who parted the waters, the God who sent the plagues, the God who delivered us from slavery, the God of our fathers is going to speak from the mountain. Is everybody ready? Are you ready to hear what God has to say? That was the thunder. It didn't quite come across. What are you supposed to do with this? How do you think the Israelites respond to something like that? Do you think that they lived 400 years in Egypt, thinking it was perfectly all right to kill whoever they wanted? And now, thankfully, God has come down to the mountain to tell them that, no, you can't do that. Do you think that the Babylonians and the Egyptians who lived for hundreds, thousands of years before this moment at Mount Sinai, that they lived their lives in their cultures and all found it perfectly acceptable to kill whoever they wanted? My point is, this isn't new information. This may be heaven-shaking, but it's not earth-shattering. I just made that up. That's all right. Let me write that. Okay. And then you ask the question, so why did God bother making the trip down the mountain? To tell them something that everybody, not just them, but everybody already knew. What is revelation here? If he is telling them old news, commonplace, and that's not just true with this one. Adultery, theft, false witness, all things that anybody in the ancient world would have acknowledged as the way that society ought to be. Why then do we think that these are so important? You've got friends and neighbors, fellow employees who don't believe the Bible at all and don't even believe in God, yet they may be very upright people who live in this way. And it's not just because at some point God told the Israelites that and it's kind of rippled through society. We need to do some probing here. We need to understand what's going on here at Sinai. Curious? I tell my students that curiosity is one of the first steps to faithful interpretation. Curiosity to ask questions you haven't thought to ask before. Curiosity to ask the hard questions. Curiosity not to settle for kind of your humdrum rut, but maybe to think something different. A willingness to be surprised. I tell my students that if you can no longer be surprised by the text, you're not in a good place. Curiosity and a willingness to look at new evidence and to think differently. I just spent 3-4 years writing a Daniel commentary. I changed my mind about dozens of things. And on some things, after I wrote the chapter, I went back and changed my mind again. I've had to learn not to be insecure about changing my mind. I've occasionally heard a senior colleague say, well, how could I possibly change my mind? That would mean I'd have to face the fact that for 40 years I've taught students something that was wrong. And my question is, does not changing your mind change that? It only extends your track record. So, on the basis of these new questions, we have to ask the question, what is the Torah? Since we usually translate the word Torah, law, we usually automatically think of it as legislation. Because in our cultural river, law comes about through legislation. So when we read intuitively, not even thinking about some of these things, we automatically think that the biblical law, Torah, is legislation. Scrap it, start at the beginning. We have to ask the question whether it is legislation. We cannot assume the Torah is legislation. Maybe if our evidence shows it, we could readopt that label. Don't get your hopes up. We can't immediately think of it as a moral system. We often do. The 10 Commandments, the core of morality, a moral system given to us by God. Those are assumptions. And those assumptions cannot stand unexplored. So we can't assume. We could talk about a moral system. We could talk about a social system. Some people have real trouble with that one. If the Old Testament Torah is a social system that God gave, well, why does God therefore endorse slavery? Is God endorsing misogyny? Is God endorsing all of these things that we find in the Torah? So again, we have to back up, ask the question, is Torah supposed to be a social system for Israel? Is it supposed to be a social system beyond Israel? We have to be curious and ask the questions. We have to ask the question, what makes the Torah revelation? Again, thou shalt not kill isn't really revelatory by itself. So what does make these revelation? Now, I'm going to suggest that what we've got here is a collection of legal sayings. That's not the same thing as laws or legislation. We have a collection of legal sayings, and we have to figure out how those work in the ancient world, and that those legal sayings are for wisdom purposes, not for legal purposes per se. And this is all of what we're going to be unpacking this week. I'm trying to redirect you from legislation, morality, social system, rotate you around, start thinking about wisdom. It's interesting that even when you read Proverbs, it talks about Proverbs as Torah. In Deuteronomy, it talks about Torah as wisdom. So I'm not doing this without biblical substantiation. And the way that all fits in, here's how it fits together. Okay, some of you probably have watched the TV shows, there's so many gazillions of them, Law and Order. And we know the phrase, we use it in English, law and order, because we believe that law brings order. And therefore, we tend to like law, except when we find ourselves, we tend to like law because we place a high value on order. Now, we're not the only ones to do that. In fact, most societies place a high value on order. They just might see different ways to accomplish it. But the ancient world, order is arguably at the very top of the value system. Now, here's a piece of information that you should understand. Wisdom is the pathway to order. That's what wisdom is. When you think, most of you have probably done some reading in the book of Proverbs. When you think through the book of Proverbs, all of that wisdom is to bring about order. Order in the family, order between spouses, order between parents and kids, order in how you interact with others through what you say, order with regard to the right way and the wrong way. Wisdom is the pathway to order. And the way a society conducts itself with judges, with crimes that need to be assessed, with social ways of thinking, all of those are ways to achieve order. Wisdom is the way to achieve order. Law can achieve some modicum of order, but if it's law without wisdom, doesn't work. Wisdom is the pathway to order. Now, it's interesting, when we think of responding, when we were thinking of the law, how do you respond to law? You obey. Commandments, you obey. But what about wisdom? How do you respond to wisdom? That's not obedience anymore, although sometimes wisdom calls for obedience in some way to some authority. But wisdom is achieved through heeding, observing. It's interesting that in Hebrew there is no word for obey. But you say, but I see the word obey in my Bible all the time in the Old Testament. Yes, that's true. That word that they translate obey is a combination of a verb and a preposition. The verb is to hear. And the preposition makes it to listen to. So we are called to heed wisdom, observe wisdom. After all, you would never look at the book of Proverbs and say, I want to obey the book of Proverbs. That would be just a non sequitur. But when we reduce Torah to commands to be obeyed, we turn them into a checklist. We call it legalism. It happens all the time. Pharisees did it, churches do it, families do it. Once we can make it a list, now we can make it a checklist. And now we can say, did it, did it, did it, did it. And it's no longer wisdom, it's simply conformity to a demand. Remember the rich young ruler, right? Comes to Jesus, Jesus said, well, keep the commandments. Did it, did it, did it, did it, did it. Then Jesus says, well, you're missing something here. You're not seeing the bigger picture. Here's what you have to do. Oh no, another thing on the checklist? No, no, no. You can't reduce wisdom to a checklist. And if the Torah and the Decalogue are wisdom, then they shouldn't be used as a checklist. That's not really what Torah is doing. Now, for those of you who are in the first session, you'll notice that Sky is very effective at punctuating his talks with stories. I punctuate mine with cuneiform texts. You know, it's not quite the same, I get it, okay? So, cuneiform texts. There are a bunch of them that we know from the ancient world. I'm just putting a little list up there now. You can see pictures. You know, the one on the right, let's read that together. Oh, never mind, okay. So these are lists of legal provisions that we know from the ancient world. Now you can look at those dates, and I don't know how firmly you have ancient chronology in your mind, but Moses is placed at the earliest about 1500, and more often more about 1300 or 1250. So you can see that all except the old Assyrian laws come before Moses. Moses is not doing something unique in that regard. When God gives Moses this Torah, this is kind of a well-known practice existing in the ancient world, providing these lists of legal provisions. Now, that ends up forming what we could call a genre. And whenever we read a piece of literature, we're going to interpret it best, read most faithfully, when we take account of the genre in the way that we read it. So our question is, what can we learn about how these texts functioned in the ancient world? And then we can ask the question, how are the Israelite texts in the Torah similar and different? It's going to be both. There's always both similarities and differences. You could compare any two of these and see similarities and differences. Okay, so we're going to try to find out what these are doing and whether what these are doing will help us understand what the Torah is doing, and eventually what the Decalogue is doing as part of the Torah. You with me? I'm trying to keep you on the train here. Many of you are trying to jump off. I see that now, okay? I'm trying to keep you on the train. So let's see what we can learn about these legal texts from the ancient world. The one you see on the right of your screen there is a little portion of the Stele of Hammurabi. When it was first found, they called it the Code of Hammurabi. But notice there's an assumption there. By calling it a code, they're making the assumption that it's a law code. And a law code is a certain type of document. It's a type of document that actually legislates, that is then used for the basis of judging cases. There's an assumption about the nature of the document just by labeling it a code. Now, we found out that it's not that eventually. It takes time, but it's not that. But yet still sometimes, especially in elementary school textbooks, middle school textbooks, they still call it the Code of Hammurabi, and they treat it as if it's legislation, even though at the academic level it's recognized that's not the case. These are not actual legislation, and they're not even sample verdicts, though maybe some of them were a verdict at some point or another, but that's not the point. We have to ask the question, what are they doing when they make up these lists? And we have to ask that because we're going to get to Exodus or Deuteronomy, and there they are, the lists. And we don't want to assume we know what the text is doing from our cultural river. We want to try to understand that cultural river. Hanging in there? I told you I was going to be stretching you. Okay? Everybody good? Now, what we find out is, and this is a long process, I can't tell the whole backstory, but what we find out is that in these legal provisions lists, these are wisdom lists. They look like laws to us. If somebody does such and such, then this is what will happen to them. They look like laws to us, but that's only if we're predisposed to read them as laws. Instead, you see the picture at the top of the stele? The standing figure, which you can hardly see, he's over on the left there, is the king, Hammurabi. The seated figure is the god Shamash. Shamash is the sun god, and he's the god of justice because the sun sees all. So he's enthroned, and Hammurabi's standing before him. When they first found this stele in 1902, they said, oh, here's the God giving the law to Hammurabi, just like Yahweh gives the law to Moses. Hey, look at that, isn't that it? No, that's not what it is at all. You'll notice that what Shamash is holding in his hand does not look like tablets of stone. It's a rod and a ring, which clearly does not have any law written on it. So then they said, so he's giving Hammurabi the authority to make laws. Well, that was a great idea, but then we found lots of images of Shamash seated on his throne, nobody in front of him, and he's still holding those things. And the fact is, those are his insignia of authority. He's not giving them to anybody. He's saying, I'm the boss, see? Here's my badge. And here we find that these lists of provisions are not going from Shamash to Hammurabi, they're coming from Hammurabi to Shamash. Hammurabi is making his annual report. He says, I've been a wise and just king. Now, you want some illustrations? In my kingdom, this is what we would do. And so these lists aren't the laws, are not legislation, they're his examples of his wisdom that leads to justice. There is no statutory law attested in the ancient Near East. Our society is run by statutory law. Congress makes the laws, the judges rule by the laws. And I'm sorry if this verdict doesn't make any sense, but this is what the law says. Statutory law did not exist in the ancient world. It's not in their cultural river. They counted on customary law, and that's why they counted on elders, judges, but the wisest of all, in their view, was the king. And so the king was trying to lay down the elements of wisdom so that judges in the realm could judge with wisdom and bring about justice. These are wisdom lists, wisdom for the practitioners, the judges, so they will be able to reflect the wisdom of the king, who, of course, they believed was given wisdom by the gods. I realize that this is a little bit of a tedious process, but this is all part of trying to understand what was going on in the ancient cultural river so that we can try to read the Torah through those lenses instead of through our own. So something like the Hammurabi stele is trying to reflect legal wisdom that will enhance the reputation of the king, because that's all important. It was still politics, yeah. The reputation of the king. So these are not laws. They are legal type provisions. They are illustrations. So let's run through some of that very quickly. This fits into a larger genre. In Mesopotamia, they loved lists. And I don't just mean like making to-do lists. Some of you probably make to-do lists. I certainly do. I live by my to-do lists. Okay, but they made lists that would communicate wisdom. They did it in the Bible. 1 Kings 4 talks about Solomon as one who categorized plants and animals, collected proverbs, right? That was all expression of wisdom. Now, the Mesopotamians loved to do this, and the nature of these wisdom lists, here I'm going to give you a word that you probably don't usually use, but you can understand it, and that is aspective. You know the word aspect has a particular aspect to it. Okay? Aspective describes these lists. That is, they are illustrations, examples. They're not intended to be comprehensive, and they aren't. Proverbs, or the book of Proverbs in the Bible, is aspective. It doesn't give you every single situation of wisdom. It never could. And so it's aspective. And I'm going to be suggesting that in the Torah, the legal provisions there are aspective. So get used to the word. We'll be using it. And it simply means that they're not comprehensive, not exhaustive. They give examples. In Mesopotamia, we find it in lists of Proverbs. The earliest literary texts that we have in any language of any place are Sumerian Proverbs, a list of Proverbs. So this goes all the way back, but they have lists of, in their medical texts, diagnoses and how they would either diagnose or treat the symptom. Divination, all of their lists of observations of the celestial heavens and the movement of the planets and all of these things. So they have plenty of lists in Mesopotamia. It's a way to do wisdom. In the legal category, these are examples of what justice would look like. Examples of what justice would look like if you have wise judges. And that's to equip practitioners. Aspective lists circumscribe and describe. Circumscribe. Okay, if you were ever in an art appreciation class, freshman year in college at Gen Ed, this should be easy. And you take art appreciation. And the professor comes up the first day of class looking very pensive and says, "What is art?" Hoping to kind of get you thinking about this art appreciation thing. What is art? Tell me what art is. And they might start raising kind of, well, Rembrandt is art, and somebody else might say Jackson Pollock's art, and boo, his, or whatever. That this is art, and that is art, and this is art. And, and for every one that's named, the professor puts a dot on the board. Dot, 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 dot. All the different kinds of art. Now, by doing that, they're not defining art. Because as we all know, art really can't easily be defined. But at the end of getting a list of 30, 40, 50, 60 dots on the board, likely the professor would draw a circle around all the dots and say, that's art. Aspective. Examples. Because it's not really definable. Circumscribe and describe rather than define or exhaust a topic. So these legal texts have these provisions. Lists of examples were used to circumscribe wisdom connected to a particular area, with the result that the practitioners could understand concepts and apply them to their work. In the legal realm, these documents were neither legislative documents dictating morality, nor were they a social system's rules. They gave wisdom from the king about what justice would look like. But the judges still had to learn that wisdom, and from that, make their verdicts in a case. Again, in the ancient world, they did not use statutory law, they used customary law. And the judges were expected to have deep understanding of the customs. So what are we going to do when we get to the Torah? Methodologically, I propose that we should not start with us, with our statutory, legislative system, and then try to move to where Israel was. We're going to do better starting in the ancient world, and then figure out how Israel might be different. Because Israel is closer to a Babylonian than to us. So if we've got our modern systems here and the Babylonian, ancient Near Eastern systems here, we're not going to find Israel here. We're not even going to find them here. We're going to find Israel here. So we do better to start with what the default was in their world, and then figure out how God speaking to them helped them transcend that cultural river, though they were still deeply ingrained in it. So if we start thinking in those terms, we have to ask the question, how do these legal lists, and remember, don't lose sight, the Decalogue is a significant part of this legal list. It's the one we know best. So the Decalogue is always hovering just below the surface in what we're talking about here. So how do these legal lists work in the ancient world? The first point I want to make is one that helps us to see a significant difference. The focus is not just on justice like it was in the rest of the ancient world. It's on holiness. Now, for this, I have to explain a little something about holiness. And the very fact that I'm telling you I have to explain something about it means that I'm probably going to suggest something that you haven't been thinking before. Sorry, it's what I do. We open up to some place like Leviticus 19:2, and our Bibles read, "Be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy." And we say, a list. Here's something that I need to do. I need to be holy. I need to achieve this. I need to accomplish something so that I can be holy. It's a command. It's an imperative. No, it's not. The Hebrew verb form there is not an imperative. It's an indicative. And therefore it should be translated, you are or will be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. Not be holy. No, you are holy, because I, the Lord your God, am holy. What's going on here? What's happening? Why does it say you are holy? As if it's an accomplished fact, or at least one to be accomplished in the very near future. You will be holy. It's not you will be once you are able to achieve it. You are holy, and the reason they are holy is because God said so. Holiness is not an achievement. It's a status. It's a status given by God. It's kind of the same way that in Christian theology we often talk about justification. You know, we can't earn our salvation, we can't justify ourselves. Justification is a free gift given by God because of Christ's death for us. So that's a status, not something we can earn or achieve. Holiness is the same way. Holiness is a status given by God. What's happening? God has designated Israel as his people by covenant. I am Yahweh, I will be your God, you will be my people. I, the Lord your God, am holy, now you are too. I just gathered you to myself, and you are now part of my identity. And I am part of your identity. And so I will live among you and walk among you, and I will be your God, and you will be my people. You are holy because you are mine. And you can't lose it. I gave it to you. You can't get it on your own. There's no holy store. You can only be holy because I've made you holy and brought you into the circle of my identity. And when God does that for a people, he takes a grand risk. Because we are flawed. And if God is going to invest his reputation in us, that's a great risk. The Torah is to help Israel understand how they're going to be reflecting Yahweh's reputation because they are holy, because he is holy, and they are his people. Nothing, anything like that in the ancient Near East. Remember, similarities and differences. We need to do them both. Genre, we've got similarities. Holiness is a difference. And there is an order to be achieved in your society that goes beyond just the order that all the people around you think, that goes beyond just justice, that goes beyond the rituals and the way they perform them. There is an order that I'm looking for that's going to reflect my reputation that's way different. Wisdom is a path to order. Torah is a wisdom document. Torah is the pathway to order. Yeah, we also know that these are covenant stipulations. Covenant stipulations. Okay, think about ancient Near Eastern treaty. Let's do some more Mesopotamian cuneiform documents. Okay, just to break it up. Okay, treaties between, say, the Assyrians and peoples that they conquer. Okay, the Assyrian king is the suzerain, the almighty king. And by virtue of either defeat or collapse or surrender, these other nations become vassals to the suzerain. And to mark that and describe that, they make a treaty. And the treaty is going to list the stipulations. That is, how do you act as a vassal so that you will be a suitable vassal to the suzerain? How will you act as a vassal so that the suzerain's reputation will be enhanced? How do you act as a vassal so that I don't come in and destroy you? Okay? The treaty. Torah makes up the stipulations of the covenant, which was very much like treaties in the ancient world. Yahweh is the suzerain. It's one thing to say he is their God, but the covenant goes further than that. He is their king. They are his vassals. And their job, their whole life, is to enhance the reputation of God. If you were in the first hour and Sky talked about the reputation of God, holding that in mind as we pray. So we have these stipulations. So these stipulations are given to Israel in the covenant to help them achieve order that would be appropriate for this covenant relationship between themselves and Yahweh when they are his holy people whom he has chosen to be his. See the picture fitting together? Remember, we're going to be fitting the Decalogue into this picture. So we have to get the picture right here. They describe what was current in Israel and convey the reputation that Yahweh wishes to present for himself in the context of the ancient Near East. Remember, God works in culture. And so we're going to have to look at that kind of context as well. Now, that's gotten us through this general introduction to ancient Near Eastern backgrounds and methodology, accountability, faithful interpretation, reading ancient Near Eastern stuff, then understanding the legal provisions lists and the list wisdom. And see how far we've gone? One of my most important jobs as an educator is to put information on the table that people wouldn't necessarily get to on their own. And that's what I've been trying to do this morning. Lay this information out on the table, on the screen, so that we can take that into account. And that doesn't mean that your interpretation process is going to lead you to the same place my interpretation process does. That's okay. But it's very difficult to process the information that we encounter in the Torah if we don't have a little bit of this cultural background to work with. So that's what I'm trying to give you. Now, before we're done today, I want to give a couple commercials. The book that we're working from is The Lost World of the Torah. Scotty mentioned it earlier. It's a book that I did with my son. And it works through all of this material and more. It's also got a nice fat appendix that has the treatment of each of the 10 words, the Decalogue, in it. So lots of what we're going to be doing this week is in this book. I've got a bunch of them in the back and at a steeply discounted price. So if you're interested in being able to refresh your minds on this and read some more that's involved that we won't get to this week, that would be where you'd get it. It's also covered somewhat in a larger approach, my Old Testament theology for Christians. This is a book of Old Testament theology that's really based on the premise that we have to start by understanding the ancient Near East and then understand, like we did today, how Israel is different. Recognize the similarities and classify the differences. And then say, okay, how does that move to our theology? And the enduring theology for us is typically in those things that are different. The commonalities are just the starting point. But that's how they're different. So I wanted to show you those. I also, let me see now, I've got to switch to Google here. Let me see if I can do this. If I put to end that and end that, and do you have that on the screen? What's on the screen? Is there a Google thing on the screen? Yeah, there it is. Okay. So another book that I've done is called the Bible Story Handbook. I don't have any of them with me, but I wanted to point this out because just this week, and maybe not even the whole week, it's on special on Kindle for $2.99. This is a resource for parents, for Sunday school teachers. Pastors use it too. And it goes through 175 stories in the Bible. It doesn't tell the story. Rather, it says, how can you tell the story better? And I give some background information. I give some contextual information in Scripture. I even talk about what your objectives or applications ought to be, and even mistakes to avoid. So I just bring it to your attention because it's on special sale on Amazon this week on the Kindle version. If you use Kindle, $2.99 is a pretty decent price. And that's also something similar for Demons and Spirits, another book that I did with my son. The last one, Bible Story Handbook, I did with my wife. I love collaborating with my family. So this one is, I think, my most recent book. Demons and Spirits in Biblical Theology. And again, it's Kindle special right now, $9.99. So it's more than $2.99, but at any rate, if that's a topic that is of interest to you. So those are a couple things that are around on the web. Again, I don't have those books back there. Very good deals on Kindle. Now, there's one more thing that I want to show you. Okay, is anybody aware of the TV series The Chosen? Anybody? A few of you have been watching that. Came out maybe in December or so. They're now finished their second season, so they've done 16 episodes on the life of Jesus. I tend to be pretty skeptical about Bible movies because Hollywood doesn't have a great track record for doing them well and respecting the Bible. So I'm typically pretty skeptical, but around Christmas time, some of our small group at church was watching them and said, oh, they're really good. And, I kind of, yeah, right, okay, maybe, and was skeptical. But finally my wife said, if everybody in our small group's watching it, we should watch it just so we have some knowledge. She's so smart. Just so we have some, for conversation. So I said, okay, all right, we'll watch it. So we watched it, and I loved it. They really did a very good job. I think one of the most incredible parts of it is that you really capture a Jesus who is personable and able to be in conversation. Anyway, this isn't a commercial for that. A couple months ago, I got a phone call from some people who had been working with The Chosen, and they said, we're going to do a whole Old Testament series called The Covenant. And so I thought, well, that's interesting. I'm glad you're telling me about it. They said, we want you to be the Old Testament consultant. I said, oh, that's cool. Now this is cool. Okay, do I get to go to Hollywood? So they're putting this series together. The pilot's going to be Daniel. Just spent 4 years writing a commentary on Daniel. And so I've got this is a 1.5-minute sizzle reel to tell you about that. So let me see if I can get that going here. See if you can hear the sound okay. So there you go. It's been a kind of exciting ride. They flew me to Morocco in June so we could scout out venues. They're going to tape it in Morocco. And so I got to work with the director and the set designer and trying to think about how to do this well. Just the idea that we can tell the Bible stories authentically and preserving the Bible's message and also make it good cinematography. So I'm excited about it. I just wanted to share that with you, and so you can keep an eye for it. Yeah. So, do you have any questions that we could ask at this point? I've dumped a whole lot of information on you. Yes, sir, you have to speak up so I can hear you.
When you were talking about the judges using customary culture, decisions, suggestions from the king and so on, could you help us or kind of give us a short version of how a decision was made? Did the judges rely on input from the king a lot? Or, how did that take place?
Okay, so the question is, in a system of customary law, how did the judges arrive at their decisions? Did they rely on the king giving them information? And no, the king had these wisdom lists, but he wasn't on call for all the decisions they had to make. Remember, you see a little bit of this in Exodus 18 when Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, comes and sees Moses sitting there judging cases all day. And he said, "Excuse me, Moses, can I have a word? This is stupid. You really shouldn't be doing this. Set up judges." And Moses only comes into play when they have to ask God. Okay? And that's sort of the king was a Supreme Court. So the hardest decisions would come to the king. But most of the cases were heard just in council, again, elders or judges, however it was set up, and they would use their wisdom based on kind of how things have always been done, the best wisdom that we know, our community mores and values and how they're preserved, not by going to some written document or to some higher authority.
Was there any appeals process?
Were there any what?
Appeals process?
Possibly in some cultures. That's, we have thousands and thousands of Babylonian court documents that show us kind of the workings of the court. And sometimes, yes, you could appeal. Mm-hmm. Yes, sir.
We have an example when they're going through the wilderness and the guy goes out on the Sabbath and he collects wood and ends up stoning him. Okay, how do we make a cultural jump today in comparison to our shopping or mowing the lawn on the Sabbath
Yeah.
or something like that?
Yeah, well, before we can answer that, we have to ask what the 10 words are all about so that we can have some kind of idea of how we need to use them or apply them today. So yes, examples like that are very helpful because that gives us some material to evaluate how much can we extrapolate this? How much does it ripple across all cultures? And we're going to have to answer those questions first and then get to more of the specifics. So you're asking a wonderful Friday question. Yes, sir.
Our culture today is deeply troubled by truth being distorted and ruined. We have commentaries on our shelves, and we can go and do our best we can to decipher a text of the scriptures. And yet you're telling us now that some of the things that you wrote, if I pull my Genesis commentary off the shelf, am I going to still find truth? Can I still preach it? Or how do I determine then what is there to keep and what you're shedding new light on is from documents that were just found.
Mm-hmm.
We're in a culture today where all of that's questioned, and now I'm even questioning the things I didn't think I ever had to question.
So how do we know what to rely on? How can we do our research? If we're using a book that's 20 years old, how do we know that the field hasn't shifted or that person, the author, hasn't shifted? When I look at my Genesis commentary, which I published 20 years ago, so I wrote it a few years before that, there are a few things in there that I've changed my mind on. Not massively, but a few things that I've changed my mind on. I'm in the process of doing the 4th revised edition of my survey of the Old Testament, and my mind has changed on some things. So how do you know what you can trust and who you can trust when you rely on other people? And of course, we all rely on other people. You know, I tell my students that interpretation has to be a community act because anybody, any of you, any of my students could make observations that I wouldn't make, that I overlooked it. Any of you could have insights, even if you don't know Hebrew or Babylonian culture, you could still have insights, ask a question that I wouldn't have thought of. And so the idea of interpretation as a community experience, but that means interpretation is also a moving target. It's something that we are constantly in progress, okay? There's a fly buzzing around my face. I was at a wedding once and the singer was singing and it was a very hot day and a fly was just buzzing around and she was trying to do, shoot the fly away. So I'm working hard not to do that. Anyway, so the best interpretation is the one with the best evidence. Now, when I wrote my commentary, when I write any of my material, I try to do what my 7th grade math teacher taught me. Show your work. Don't just give me the answer. Okay, if it's good for math, it's good for interpretation. I want to show the evidence that I used. Now those pieces of evidence, again, things can change. New evidence could come to the table. Or the element that I was basing my evidence on might have been based on a presupposition that I had, that I now say, wait a minute, I've rethought that presupposition and I really shouldn't hold on to that. That makes it difficult, but still our resources, like our commentaries, can get us further along the way. Again, the idea that I have when I write a commentary is not to say, and so this is truth. You mentioned truth. Rather, it's to say, this is my best shot at the moment, given what I've got. This is the best interpretation I can make. Here's why I go that direction, and it's the best that I've got. And other people, of course, come to different conclusions. And so the idea is, well, all we can do is the best we can do. We certainly can't assume that once we make an interpretation, no matter how highly respected an academic somebody might be, they could change their mind or the evidence could change. So when I read a commentary, I wouldn't say I'm looking for truth, I'm looking for help. I'm looking for observations that other people have made. I'm looking for expertise that other people have so that I can benefit from it. Many times I will find a good piece of evidence in a commentary and I totally disagree with the commentator. I don't like his presuppositions, I don't think he does good evidence, I don't agree with his conclusions, etc. But he might have just one line, one observation. I say, that's important. I don't like what he does with it, and I don't really like where he ends up, but that's important. I'm looking for help. And again, commentaries can help us, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they do. Reference works can help us. Again, reference works are very helpful, but they're not always the cutting edge of what's going on in academia. Translations can help us, notes in study Bibles. But again, we're looking for help. I don't know if it'd be better if we thought, well, here I've got the canned truth and I can get it. But it's more complicated than that. One more, yes? Am I going to say anything about them? I don't have that in any of my my PowerPoint slides, so let me say a quick word about it now. The Torah is on the tablets. We don't know if it's just the Decalogue. One thing that I'm going to bring out probably tomorrow is that there are 3 versions of the Decalogue in the Pentateuch, 2 in Exodus, 1 in Deuteronomy. And the second one in Exodus is far different than the first one in Exodus and the other one in Deuteronomy. Torah is on the tablet. When they say 2 tablets, it might mean 2 copies of the same tablet. Sometimes that's how it worked in the ancient world. So, again, there's a lot that goes without being said, and we're trying to go in and figure out what's going on. So, yeah, I said the last, but yeah, go ahead.
I'm just curious, you talked about the ancient cultural river and the modern cultural river,
Yeah?
but I wonder if there are lots of modern
Sure.
cultural rivers. There's western, eastern,
Right.
red states, blue states,
Exactly.
and a lot of these are all within the church.
Right. So we have the ancient cultural river, and the ancient cultural river has the Hittites and the Egyptians and the Babylonians, and they're all somewhat different, but there is some continuity between them. The Babylon of Hammurabi in 1750 BC is different from the Babylon of Nebuchadnezzar in 600 BC. But there's still continuities. Same in our modern cultural river. Of course, there's cultural river in Asia or in each country in Asia. There's Eastern Europe, there's South America. We have loads of different cultural rivers. And so modern cultural rivers can be very different from one another. You can't even talk about a European cultural river. We've got Italians and we've got Swiss. Enough said. So, and even within our country, there are different cultural rivers, and increasingly so. So again, there still is some continuity between closely related cultural rivers, but also some differences. Okay, I better let you go. Thank you, you've been very attentive. After dumping cuneiform text on you, you probably won't come back, but oh well.